All right, everyone, welcome. My name is Maria Wilhoit. Thank you for joining the American History Lecture Series on behalf of 1991 here in Mariupol, Ukraine. This is actually part 5 of 7 on American history. I've done 4 other lectures previously. Regardless if you've come to the previous lectures or haven't, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. This one will cover where we kind of left off, starting with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, and then it will end around the end of the civil rights movement around that period. And to begin with this lecture, I have a picture here. It's actually not a picture; it's a photograph of an exhibit in the Museum of American History. It's actually titled "The Star Spangled Banner," and I thought it was a really beautiful. First of all, I think it's a very beautiful picture. I did not take it. I was there and I saw the exhibit, but I never took a picture. Don't know why. But this is a picture from online, and it's very interesting. And I chose it because if you look at it from a glance, you recognize that it's familiar. It's actually supposed to be the U.S. Flag, but it's also very unfamiliar. It doesn't have the 50 stars, and it doesn't have actually. I don't even think it has 13 stripes, but we know it resembles it. It has something like red and white, but it's more like a red, orange, and silver. And it's supposed to be a modern rendition of the American flag, in part because it comes from the our anthem, which we call the Star Spangled Banner. And the Star Spangled Banner was a song that we learned about a couple of lectures ago. It came from Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. And Star Spangled Banner actually means a banner, like a flag. And star spangled means it's almost shiny. It's like a star, it glistens, it shines. So, this is actually kind of a more accurate depiction of the title Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem. But I chose it because during this time period that we're going to cover, it really marks, especially after World War II, it really marks the start of modern America that we know it today. The America, I would say, before 1945, when World War II ended, is very different from America that we have after the war. And we're just going to touch a little bit about post America or post war America, but I still wanted to show you this image because it's really, I wanted to foreshadow kind of how we're moving into a very new transition in American history of modern America. And it's kind of the America that you probably know about, that my parents grew up in, and then my grandparents grew up in too. In fact, I can't even really imagine what it would be like to grow up in America in the 1920s or 30s even. It was a very difficult and different country as it is today now. So that's why I chose it, and it's a very beautiful sculpture, I thought, and it's at the National Museum of American History in Washington D.C. So if you ever get a chance to go to Washington D.C., I really recommend the museums, and they're generally for free. So to begin with, let me just continue. Just to go over some of our key lecture points from last time, there were 3 main topics that we covered: immigration, the vast amount of immigrants that came to our country. And I have to say, I'm very sorry, I didn't cover the early 20th century immigration, which is when my grandparents actually came on my mother's side from Italy. And it's also where a lot of Ukrainian and Russians came into America. You still have Ukrainians that come to America after the early 1900s, but this is where a bulk amount of them come, and many of them are Jewish. A lot of Jewish immigrants come to America, in part because, as we know, the Russian Empire wasn't very friendly to Jews. Later on, neither was the Soviet Empire, even though there were a lot of Jews in the intelligentsia. So we have a lot of immigration, and this increases movement to cities. It also increases labor for farms and factories. So we just have this big growth in numbers of our population and this big growth in industry. And even though it's very slow at first, our industry is slow starting in the early 1800s. It completely changes after the Civil War, really. And it's kind of similar actually to World War II. There are parallels between industry after the Civil War and industry after World War II. War has very negative consequences, but one of the, I don't even know if I should say positive consequences of war, is that it does have a tendency to increase industry and prosperity and economic growth. Not always. Every war situation is different. But the Civil War in America was kind of like a total war. It completely encapsulated, or it took over our entire society, our entire economy. The same with World War II, which we'll learn. Not so much World War One. But anyway, so last week we started to talk about industry and how it kept growing, growing, and growing. And finally, it crashed, really. It was too much speculation, too many people trying to put money into industries. And then you always have this thing we say in economics, the bubble burst, it crashed. There's only so much speculation you can have. And that is what begins our Great Depression, which is where we left off. And finally, our last major point was um, this feeling, I put it all together, of manifest destiny, exceptionalism, and isolationism. All three go hand in hand. There was this belief that America was exceptional, that it was unlike other countries in the world. It was kind of blessed by God in some ways to be a strong nation, to be a growing nation. Like our prosperity is due to the fact that we're somehow fated for it, either by divine blessings or just some other spirit out there. And this is a very big feeling within American society, especially in American politics. And it's one of the reasons why we have isolationism. Um, Unlike now, we were a very isolationist country before World War II and even up to World War II. We didn't feel that we needed to be involved in European affairs. Let Europe do Europe and let America do America. And we did not enter World War One until it was not too late, but it was late. It was 1917, 3 years after the war even started. So we were late, and this was only we only entered due to pressure from our press, due to scandal of, the Germans sinking our ships. And this isolationism was first tested with World War One, and it's going to be tested again in World War Two. And I'll just go a little bit ahead. America, as we know it in terms of isolationism, really is no longer, even under Donald Trump, who has kind of advocated for an America First policy, meaning America should be thinking about its people first and not other countries. It's kind of going back to isolationism. Regardless of whether that's what he wants for America, America will never be isolationist. I mean, no country can really be isolationist. Even North Korea relies on other nations for supplies, for weapons. So isolationism is kind of I think, a dead policy right now. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe in 50 years we'll go back to it. But our world is just too global now, and it really starts after World War II. So anyway, last topic. And also I just want to say, I'm very sorry. I was actually watching the video for my last lecture. And first of all, I noticed I use my hands a lot. I can't help it. It's just a habit of mine. I talk with my hands, as I say. Um, I just can't keep them still. So I'm very sorry about that if that bothers you. And another thing is, I noticed that my pictures sometimes were behind my video, and I'm very sorry about that. I didn't realize that when I put a when I put a picture or a caption on the right hand side of my PowerPoint here, that you can't see it. So I tried to not do that this lecture. So pardon me for that. I should have learned that earlier. It's taken me up to 4 lectures. So forgive me. Anyway, so we'll continue. We have the Great Depression, and it's very interesting because we're also going through a depression right now in America because of the pandemic. So it's kind of interesting to see the parallels and to kind of, notice what should the government do, what should it not do. Maybe some lessons, maybe not. So Franklin Roosevelt is the president who takes over basically at the height of the Great Depression. And one of the reasons why he is elected is because he's very optimistic. he's not, I would say, totally idealistic. His head isn't in the clouds somewhere, but he is a very optimistic person. He wants to get America out of the depression. He believes that the government has a responsibility to its citizens to get itself out of the depression, which was a very big shift in policy for a president. Before Roosevelt, really, the government was kind of like a supporter of business, but it was never the catalyst. It was never the captain of a ship. It was maybe one of the sailors on a ship that was helping it and maybe helping to put fire or coal into the engine, but it was never the captain. And now with Roosevelt, you start to have a captain of a ship, and that captain is the American government, especially with the president. And we'll learn about that. So, as part of his New Deal, this deal that he wants to create with the American people, similar to his ancestor Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted a square deal, Roosevelt wants a New Deal. Basically, he wants a deal between government and citizens. And the deal is going to be, we're going to help you, and the way you help us is you're going to work for us, actually. So that was the trade off. And there are a few steps that Roosevelt has to take before he can really try to restart the American economy. So first of all, he sets up one of the reasons why we had a Great Depression is the banks failed. With the American they were investing and speculating their money in big businesses, and then they couldn't get it back. They lost, and when a bank invests money, it's usually not its own money, it's the people's money, right? Who put their money into the bank. So it was such a huge ripple effect when the banks failed, because then the citizens who put their money in the banks didn't have any money. So Roosevelt made a promise. He set up the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, excuse me, Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, I believe, and we call it the FDIC. And it's an insurance that if a bank fails, the government will give you up to a certain amount of money if you lose your money from the bank's failure. So when the banks fail, people couldn't get their money. Well, the government set up a new insurance policy that if a bank fails, you, the citizen, I think it's now up to $150,000 you can get from the bank. If you had less than that, then you would get what you had in there. But if you had more than that, you can only get up to 150,000. But that's still really good. I mean, I don't know many people in my life who have over 150,000 in their bank account, but there are people like that in America. He also Roosevelt, he also passed a Federal Emergency Relief Act. And this was kind of like what we had today with COVID. In 1933, he basically gave $3 billion to state and local governments. It was not a loan, it was here. Put this into your governments and try to prop up businesses and help citizens with unemployment. And 3 billion doesn't sound like a lot today, but it was a massive amount of money. I can't remember the last time the government spent that kind of money on anything. Maybe World War One. So this was a massive amount of money, and we actually had something similar, except it's very ironic because instead of a billion, the number was 3 trillion. And recently, the American government, about a month and a half ago, passed a huge government relief bill, basically, of $3 trillion to help American businesses and citizens during this pandemic, because a lot of businesses are shut and a lot of people are actually unemployed. We almost have the same unemployment numbers as we had during the Great Depression. So, but instead of 3 billion, it's 3 trillion, which really tells you it's almost 100 years later. Anyway, so Roosevelt, he sets up the FDIC. He passes $3 billion in Congress to help local and state governments. He also sets up the Civilian Conservation Corps. And later, he also sets up the Work Progress Administration. And part of this core group of people and this administration, it's to help employ young men. Men, because even during that time period, it was believed that men should be working and women should be staying at home. But the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, it specifically employed over 2 million unmarried men between 17 and 25. One of the reasons why they targeted unmarried men is because there's a tendency when if a man is unemployed, he's unmarried, he might commit crimes, he might go to desperate measures. So the government doesn't want that. It tries to create a stable society. But also, these are the young men who need help the most. They don't have an established career, they don't have savings, they're just beginning their lives. And these men are employed by the government to build government projects, government infrastructure like bridges, even buildings, railroads, to upgrade railroads. So these are all federal projects. And along with the Civilian Works Conservation Corps, he sets, as part of the administration, he sets up the Work Progress Administration, which we call the WPA. It's a very famous agency he creates, Roosevelt, and it employs an additional 9 million Americans. And I believe it still targets men because men are still kind of considered at this time the breadwinners of American society. So it's an additional one. And again, they're employed to do federal work and federal jobs and projects. And with the WPA, they expand the jobs to not just building bridges, but to also doing art projects, also doing writing projects, reporting, journalism. So it's hitting all sectors of society. And it doesn't sound like a lot, 2 million plus 9 million, but it's a significant amount of unemployed men and women, because at this time, the number of unemployed men, I believe, and women, I should say men and women, because there were women who had jobs. I think it was about 20 million Americans, 25 million Americans. So this is still a sizable amount. You still have unemployment, but Roosevelt is trying to decrease it. Now, just so you know, not everybody likes the government and just helping everybody, giving paychecks and, spending a lot of money. Some people really believe that the WPA was a waste of taxpayer money, that it wasn't actually really helping the Great Depression. To be honest, actually, economists still debate whether or not Roosevelt's policies were really helpful for the Great Depression or not. I mean, certainly it employed people, but in terms of actually getting us out of the depression, a lot of scholars say really it was the war that got us out of the depression. And then finally, so Roosevelt sets up projects to help employ young men, but he also gives help to farmers. He gives subsidies to farmers to produce less crops, so the prices increase. And at first, this sounds counterintuitive: produce less crops, and then to give subsidies. That just means payments. So if a farmer is producing less crops, he has to sometimes get rid of crops that he's already made. He might be losing money at this moment, so the government steps in and helps to protect that farmer from money that he's lost. But the upswing of that is then the prices increase because the supply decreases. And that was a way to try to prop up farm prices to get more money into farmers' hands, into the economy. Roosevelt also increased credit for farmers to help pay off their mortgages. And he also made sure that farms were all connected to electricity, because believe it or not, a lot of them weren't connected on an electrical grid. Many of them were isolated, they weren't connected. And to have electricity, it's a way to modernize your farm. It's a way to stay connected. So he felt like that was a big necessity as well. So this is all part of his New Deal, trying to fix the government, trying to fix the economy, really. And these are just some pictures I have of his federal projects. Here's a photograph of WPA workers. I think they're building a bridge, actually. So they weren't paid a lot. They were actually paid below the average wage during this time. But, it's better than nothing. It still helps to put food on the table. And then this is also one of the famous murals that was created during this time period as part of the WPA mural projects, artistic projects. It was by a man named Ben Shahn, who was actually a Russian Jewish immigrant. I don't know where in Russia, though. And by Russia, I mean the Russian Empire. Because not even Russian Empire now. I think he immigrated, though, No, I think Ben Shahn did immigrate when it was the Russian Empire, but when he built this mural, it was obviously the Soviet Union. So, but anyway, his ancestors were from the Russian Empire. He was a Jewish Russian immigrant, and he built this mural. And actually, he has images of immigrants arriving to America, working in the factories, and then trying to educate themselves, trying to put themselves in better jobs for themselves. So it's kind of an optimistic mural, but I think it's still very beautiful. It kind of gives a timeline of American immigration. Here are the immigrants, and they're in the factories. They're working, they're waiting. Here is another immigrant, kind of looking optimistically up. And then they're continuing to work, continuing to go to school. So it's a really beautiful mural. It's in New Jersey. And then I also have here, it's just an advertisement for the Federal Writers Project Slave Narratives. One of the projects that the WPA workers had was to actually find so during this time period, this is actually the last generation of slaves, we would say, in terms of that, the people who live, African Americans who lived during this time period in the 1930s were usually going to be children before the Civil War. So they were children during slavery, and then they grew up after the Civil War, and their time was sort of coming to an end. So one of the projects that Roosevelt had people do was to interview these slaves who were much older, but he wanted to get their accounts. He wanted to get, their experiences down on paper and preserved too. This is now in the Library of Congress. And it's actually, it's an incredible narrative project. It went across all 50 states. Well, at this time it wasn't 50, I think it was 48. But it went across all the states, and they interviewed as many slaves or former slaves as they could. Any slaves, former slaves who were alive. So it was a really incredible project, and it's widely used today for archival purposes and for historical purposes. It's one of the best accounts we have of what is slavery like in America, actually, because no other project had actually really gone out to ask, how was your life during slavery? No one really wanted to know. Um, okay, so he continuing with Roosevelt. So he had the New Deal, and part of the New Deal too was helping the average citizen, not only in employment but also just in their social security, having security in terms of their life. And prior to 1935, Americans had to save money on their own for retirement. You didn't put it into a pension fund. It was kind of you left up to you. And one of the faults of the Great Depression, why it happened, is that many Americans didn't have savings or retirement. They lived paycheck to paycheck, and to be honest, still a lot do. But even when you work at Walmart, even when you work at Subway, no matter where you work, you generally can put your money, your paycheck, into a Social Security fund. So this is a guarantee that you'll have some retirement savings. And this was so what Roosevelt did is he established the Social Security Fund, I should say. And what it guaranteed is that once you reach 65, I think it's now 67, they've increased the age. Once you reach 65, you can get the money that you saved up through your entire lifetime. You can get it from the federal government as a monthly check based on how much you put in. And this was a very big deal because, again, Americans prior to 1935 had no guarantee of savings or retirement. It was all up to them. The government was not going to help you. And I believe that you have to put money into Social Security. I could be wrong, but it is required by law that you have actually Social Security. Um, so, and one of the ways that it works, it's a little bit different now, but the way it works is that my generation that's putting money into Social Security now is actually helping to give money to Social Security recipients now. So my mom receives Social Security. So I put money into my Social Security account every month, well, when I have a job. And that money goes into the Social Security Fund in the federal government. And then that money is then a big pool of money that goes to pay for Social Security payments today. for people like my mom and other older people, older Americans. So that's how the system works. And there's always been this fear, especially among conservative Americans, that there are too many Americans who are getting older and older and not enough young Americans who are putting money into Social Security. So it's going to blow up. There's not going to be enough money. But it hasn't happened yet, thankfully. So, anyway, along with Social Security, we also have unemployment and disability help, actually. This is to help people who are unemployed, they get an unemployment check. Now, part of unemployment is that you have to be actively searching for a job. But while you're searching for a job and applying, you can receive help from the government, both from the federal government and the state governments. But it's mostly the state that actually helps you. And same with disability. If you're disabled where you can't work due to a disability, whether you got it later in life or you got it when you were born, you're also going to receive help from the government to help, live, because you can't get a job sometimes with your disability. So these were kind of like the three main things. You have retirement, unemployment, and disability. They're all part of Roosevelt's Social Security net. And this is all just to help people make sure that they don't fall off a cliff with no money, basically, that they have some net to land on if they fall. The one thing that should be noted is universal health care is never passed in our government. I don't even think it was even proposed by Roosevelt. For some reason, healthcare is one of the few areas that we haven't been able to put on a federal level. I mean, we have healthcare for veterans and we even have healthcare for federal employees, but we have no guaranteed healthcare for everyone in America. I'm not sure why. It's probably a very complicated history, but I will just say one of the big points among the Democratic Party today is to have universal health care. Obama tried it with his Obamacare, but it could be better, to be quite frank. And still, not everybody has health care in America because it's too expensive. So people feel, especially those who vote Democrat, that there should be a minimum health care. No matter who you are, no matter whether you can pay, you have a minimum health care. So, but anyway, Social Security is, it's hard for me to maybe say or really articulate, but it is one of the most groundbreaking federal projects ever in American history. In terms of it's the very first major federal law that is aimed to help all Americans in distress. It's truly the first time that the government is stepping in to help Americans, not so much so they can get something out of it. The government really doesn't in terms of money, but it's the idea of like, we need to help our citizens. We need to make sure that they have food and shelter, maybe not healthcare, but food and shelter. And it's a very revolutionary concept because prior to Roosevelt and the Social Security, we don't have anything like this in America. And this had two major consequences, really. First of all, it ensured that Americans had a guaranteed level of security or um, life or well-being. You're not going to be rich off of Social Security. You're not even going to be remotely wealthy, but you're not going to hopefully find yourself homeless. That's the goal. But so that was revolutionary in that way, but it was revolutionary because it expanded the federal government, to help Social Security to run, to make it go smoothly. The federal government had to increase in size. It had to have agencies. It had to make sure everybody was following and doing their part. And that is absolutely major because, once you expand the federal government, you really can't contract it. You can't decrease it. So I think I read somewhere that the federal government tripled in size under Roosevelt. It tripled. It's incredible. And some people didn't like that. Just so you know, this is actually a political cartoon from the Chicago Tribune in 1937. And it's actually an image of Roosevelt. He's smiling. He's got a soup bowl and a spoon, and the bowl has power. It's supposed to symbolize power, and he wants more, please. And he wants more and more. The cartoon is saying he wants more and more power from Congress. And part of the power is reorganization. and making the executive government and the executive branch bigger. So not everybody was happy. But I think one of the reasons why he was successful in getting this passed, Roosevelt, is because so many Americans were desperate for something. They needed some help. So now, just to begin with World War II, I will just say America is still isolationist. You know, even under Roosevelt, we don't want to get into European affairs. I mean, it's not that we don't know about them, but we don't want to get into them. We don't want to, create complications. So we continue our isolationism. And what's worse, during the 20s and part of the 30s, we even become protectionist, meaning we want to protect our industries from, possible harm or economic, sabotage or something like that. So under Hoover, we even placed tariffs, which are taxes on imports coming into Europe. So we're not we're not we're not even becoming less isolationism. We're coming even more to protectionism. And America is watching Europe. It's seeing what's happening. And in response to what it sees happening in Europe, it passes three neutrality acts. Because America originally wanted to be neutral in terms of foreign affairs. It didn't want to get involved with Europe. It didn't want to get involved initially in World War One. I mean, World War Two, actually. In both cases, we didn't want to get involved, but later we respond. And the three neutrality acts that we passed are just, one of them is in 1935. It prohibits the shipping of arms to nations at war. So don't get involved, don't pick sides. We also decide to not give loans to warring nations, which is actually not that nice because some of these warring nations are, our allies, especially England, which is trying to fight off and trying to become prepared for the rise of Germany, rise of Nazi Germany. So, but again, it's all of these neutrality acts are trying to make America less involved and to not step on Europeans' toes. Not trying to step on each other's feet. We're trying to keep safe in a way, distant. We also limit the trade of commercial goods to warring nations. So, and one of the rules of that Neutrality Act is that Americans, if they were going to buy goods from other nations, that good had to be transported on that nation's ships. It couldn't come on American ships. We didn't want our ships to get involved because that's what happened in World War One. Our ships got in the middle of things and then they were bombed by German U-boats. And so we're trying to avoid that. And even when the war breaks out, uh, after Mussolini invades Ethiopia and he rises to power, after Hitler takes over Germany and the Nazis take over Germany, we still want to remain neutral. We don't want to get into things. And we still remain neutral even when Adolf Hitler invades Poland. He takes it over in September 1939, and England then declares war against Germany. So even when our ally, Great Britain, joins the fight, we stand back. But we'll see later on how we can't do that. And I will say, even though Roosevelt was isolationist at first, he's not totally deaf to pleas for or cries for help. He does hear pressure and calls for help from Churchill, Winston Churchill, and he doesn't quite yet want to put American troops on the ground, but he does want to help allies. He does. And so he eventually actually convinces Congress to allow the sale and the lending of weapons to our allies. It's called the Lend and Lease Act of it's called the Lend and Lease Act, and it happens in March of 1941. And it's not it's a major first step because it's no longer really honoring the neutrality acts from a few years back. It's now taking sides, and we're taking the sides of our allies. And and FDR felt like this was important because he felt like by helping our allies, he was helping democracy to continue to fight and to possibly win. Even though we wanted to be neutral or isolationist, we didn't like what was happening in Germany and Italy. It's not something we agreed with. We still were very much a pro-democratic nation. So we wanted to help, and FDR called this, this movement to help allies with the Lend-Lease Act, called it the arsenal of democracy. Arsenal meaning, like, it's where you supply your weapons. It's I think it's like a military base where you supply all your weapons, your tanks, your guns. So he was going to give an arsenal of weapons, of supplies to our allies. And I just showed this picture. This is actually Benito Mussolini. This is one of his propaganda posters. It's in Italian, and it says, "For the leader, to us," which is very much like a fascist slogan. But it comes from early 1932. And fascism, it starts very much after World War One, the rise of it, the growth in it, in part because Europe is ravaged by economic depression. So is America, but Europe has to react in a different way than America. America is very lucky because we're surrounded by two major oceans. So we can kind of remain isolationist, kind of just, at times stick our head in the sands. It's not always a good decision, but we can do that. Not really any longer, though, as I said before. So, as I said, we were neutral and isolationist in the beginning of the war, but there is a very fateful day that changes the entire fate of America in terms of the war, and in terms of, actually, I would say today too, in terms of our modern American thinking and economics and government. And it was a major day. It's on December 7th, 1941. It's when the Japanese Empire, they made a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor is a naval base. It's a major naval base even today in Honolulu, Hawaii. Um, and interesting enough, Hawaii, I don't believe at this time was actually even a state. It was a territory of the United States. It later became a state. But they did a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. They also did it on other territories that belong to the US, but this is the most famous one because it had so many of our Navy ships, cargo, had our Navy personnel. And it was the first time, I would say, that America has really been attacked by a foreign power in recent decades. Before we kind of went out and sought war, here we're being attacked. It was a complete surprise, to be honest. And it was very deadly. I mean, 3,000 Americans died. And Japanese planes, they destroyed 6 battleships. We didn't have a lot at the time. Prior to the war, we didn't have a big military. And they destroyed a lot of our planes. So not only did we feel attacked, we felt very vulnerable afterwards, like we have to do something. And Roosevelt, he marked how famous this day was. He called it a day that will live in infamy, in terms of it will always be famous for us. It will always be, some people say that the end of World War II is the most important day in the world. For us, I think we say December 7th because it's the start of World War II, and it's the start of American um, presence and fighting in World War II. And for us, World War II doesn't end on May 8th. It ends in August, actually, 1945. So anyway, Roosevelt calls it a day that will live in infamy, and he immediately declares America's participation in World War II. It's literally the next day he declares war on Japan. He doesn't even think. Well, he does think, but he quickly responds. And then 3 days later, because Japan was in alliance with Germany and Italy also declare war on the US. So originally we were just declaring war on Japan, but now we're really and completely involved in World War II. And this is a picture on the left-hand side of President Roosevelt signing the declaration of war. I don't know who all these men are, to be honest, but that is him signing it. This is Pearl Harbor when it was actually bombing our ships. And then here is actually present day Pearl Harbor. It's now a memorial and museum. I have never been because I have never been to Hawaii. I really want to go to Hawaii, but it's kind of a far trip. It's a little bit pricey, actually. Hawaii is it's not the cheapest vacation, I'll just say that, but it's beautiful. It's a beautiful state, and you can see present day Pearl Harbor. And as you can see in the photo, this is actually the USS Arizona, which is one of the ships that was sunk. And they actually built the memorial and museum on top of this sunken ship. And I think you can even go down in the ship. They've managed to preserve parts of it and turn it into a museum. It's remarkable. I've never been inside, but um, to this day, we still kind of memorialize Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Most people always take like a moment of silence on December 7th to remember those who died on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so now we're in World War II. And I'm just going to give a general overview of World War II. It's a major war, as you all know. You recently just honored it 10 days ago, 11 days ago. You recently just, honored it and memorialized it. We actually, just so you know, don't have an official like World War II Memorial Day. We have a Memorial Day that's actually in a few days, but it's to honor all those who have died in war, not just in World War II. So, and it actually came as a result of the Civil War. And then later on, it grew into memorializing all soldiers who had died in wars. So anyway, we, as you know, we were attacked by Japan. So America has this tricky, this difficult situation of having to fight two fronts in the war. We have three major opponents, but we have two fronts. We have to fight Germany and Italy in Europe, and then we have to fight Japan in the Pacific. So it's a double-sided war for us, and it's a major naval war and it's a major army war, land war. And it takes all of our armed forces, Air Force, Army, Marines, Coast Guard, Navy, even the Merchant Marines. So, and more than 16 million Americans fought in the war. I know in the Soviet Union, more soldiers fought in the war, more soldiers died. But in terms of our previous wars, for us, it's a major war. We've never had this many soldiers fight in a war. And over 400,000 died in World War II from 1941 to 1945. And I know that's minor, very minor, compared to the Soviet Union's death. But for us, in terms of perspective, it's the second to the Civil War. So it's still for us a very major war in terms of deaths, in terms of soldiers who fought. And World War II, as I said, is a total war for us, in meaning it involves the total use of American resources, from weapons to peoples to industries and food. It it completely overtakes our country and our society and our government. It's a total war. It takes up total resources. Um, and I would say that World War II, like the Civil War, but unlike the Civil War, it has a major consequence for America. America that we know today is a result of what happened after World War II, basically. As I said, America before World War II is very different from America after World War II in many different ways. And that's something I'll cover a little bit in this lecture, but I'll actually cover more in our next lecture because, the consequences of post war America is up through today, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to today. America is just not the same. And I would say that it makes our international affairs better and worse. We become much more involved in world affairs. I think this is personally a very good thing. We're no longer isolationists as a result of World War II because we see how consequential it was for us to not be involved. But at the same time, I think it's sometimes for worse because sometimes we get too involved in other nations and too involved in world affairs that we become too powerful, and at times we make the wrong decisions. We do. And that's something also I'll cover next lecture, especially with the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, I think, shows a negative result of our increased international presence in the world. And it's a war that a lot of Americans have a hard time talking about because it had the good, the bad, the ugly, as I say. But anyway, another consequence of World War II is, like the Civil War, I would say, it's very strong in our society in terms of our cultural memory. And I know this is the same for you, and you don't even call it World War II in Ukraine. You call it the Great Patriotic War. which is a very it's a very strong word, and it's a very appropriate word, but it's very strong. But like the Soviet Union, we also had a tendency to romanticize World War II. It was a great war in terms of making us the good people, the Germans, Italians, the Japanese evil people. There was a whole nice story of heroes versus villains, good versus evil, democracy versus dictatorship. And I'm not saying that this is wrong. It's not to say that that the Germans were good in what they were doing with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, but we have a tendency to romanticize it to where then we don't actually see the realities of what happened during the war. People just want to focus on the good that happened during World War II, and sometimes they don't want to. They definitely don't want to uncover the ugly decisions, the ugly acts that were created in World War II or done in World War II. And even the bad, we barely want to touch on. The Holocaust, I don't go into it in this presentation because it's a little bit more, it's actually difficult for me to talk about because Roosevelt, and this is part of the kind of the bad and ugly of World War II. Franklin Roosevelt, he knew about the concentration camps. He knew that the Germans were having very racist, um, awful policies towards Jews, towards even other Slavic people, to other minority groups. But he didn't really do a good job stopping them. And it's complicated. This is what's difficult. I'm not sure what America could have done to stop the Holocaust, to be honest. Maybe we could have bombed the camps, but might we have killed people? Roosevelt, a lot of people criticize him for not acting soon enough and for not helping Jewish refugees. But at the same time, he was dealing with a Congress and an American society, to be quite frank, that was very anti Semitic, and that also didn't want to increase immigration. At this time, America didn't want more immigrants. It was trying to deal with the war. It didn't want to bring in new people, foreigners who may or may not act on behalf of America's interests. So he had to deal with, a domestic side that wasn't really actually wanting to help a lot of Jews. But he did know about it. So again, this is just an example of how uh, if I go to my mom and dad and I try to have a discussion with them about Roosevelt and the Holocaust, they don't really want to talk about it. They don't really know how to talk about it. It's difficult, and they don't know a lot about it, and I don't either because historians and American society don't want to talk about the ugly in World War II. Um, so anyway, I just want to say that it's in terms of America today, even we romanticize World War II, meaning we really only talk about the good. And that's not, I don't personally think that's the right decision to do. You should always take all facets of history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, even though it's very difficult as a society, um, because war is very complicated. But regardless, this generation that fought World War II and that came home after the war, many call it the greatest generation in terms of that they had to live through the Great Depression and they had to fight in this war. It's the greatest generation because they made so many sacrifices. And that is true. This was a huge sacrifice for many Americans, both in America and abroad. And I just wanted to point out, we even today in America, we have actually a National World War II museum. And I have to talk about it because it's in my home city, New Orleans. And this is building one of six. And they're actually, I think, building two more buildings. So it's a massive museum. And it kind of shows to you how Americans, in my opinion, really want to focus on the war, World War II. They want to learn more about it. They're kind of not enthralled by it, but engrossed in it, meaning they're really invested in it because, again, I think it lends itself to having a good versus evil story, a heroes versus villains story. And I think that's one of the reasons why we continue to focus on World War II and we don't really focus on the Korean War. We don't focus on the Vietnam War. Even today, we have a hard time talking about the Iraq and Afghan War because it doesn't fit into those simple dichotomy of good versus evils. That's not to say that again the Germans were not evil or that Al Qaeda is not evil. It's just, it doesn't fit so nicely into good versus bad. So, anyway, that's a general overview of World War II I had to mention. So, as I said, we have two fronts that we have to fight in America. We have the major battles here in Europe. I'm not going to go into detail on these battles because there's actually too many and there's too much we have to cover in this lecture. But these are some of the major ones. I have this map here for those, and I recommend if you want to look at this closer, you can pause on this lecture. It'll be up on YouTube later, so you can always look at this video again. But these are just some of the major battles. The first one being the Battle of Britain, a major, I know, Air Force battle. We have, of course, the Battle of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad. We have the Battle of El Alamein, I believe, El Alamein. It's actually in, I believe, Egypt. It's a major battle to move forces out of North Africa. We also have D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, and of course, the battle and the fall of Berlin. So there are many battles in World War II, but these are the major ones that we at least think about and talk about in America in terms of World War II. And in terms of our European front, one of the things about World War II is, like World War I, there's new military technology. So we have to get used to that. We have the use of radar, sonar. We also have long range missiles and rockets. So it's still a very new war for us. It's still a very deadly war. And, I will just say what I've learned is that Churchill and FDR, they view Germany as a greater threat than Japan. And the strategy with Roosevelt and Churchill is first to defeat Germany and then move on to Japan, to focus on Japan, because Germany, I guess, had greater consequences for Europe. And, America's allies were in Europe. We didn't really have many allies in Asia. So, and the way they were going to tackle Germany is by closing in on it, on its forces, first in North Africa, and then they're going to go into Italy and then into Central and Western Europe. So they were like closing in. And unfortunately for the Soviet Union had to always continuously defend the East to make sure that Germany never took over the Soviet Union. So America and Britain were focused on Southern and Western Europe, and Eastern Europe was more focused on the Soviet Union. And the thing about the European front, and this is hard, I think even some Americans forget this, but when Berlin fell on May 8th, 1945, European time, when it fell, America still had to fight the Japanese. So this was still very difficult for us. The war was never over for us when Europe ended, or when the war in Europe ended. It's celebrated. The end of World War II is celebrated on May 8th and May 9th for Europe and for the former Soviet Union. But for us, we don't celebrate it May 8th and May 9th. We don't really even celebrate it. We have to we memorialize it, but because we don't celebrate it in terms of a specific day, because we're still fighting the Japanese. So World War II for us ends much later than May. And something to note about World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt actually died before the end of the war. He died just before it. He died on April 12th, 1945. And his vice president, Harry S. Truman, takes over. And Roosevelt, I will just say this about him. Whether you like him or not, he is probably one of the most influential presidents of all time. There's maybe 5 or 10 very influential presidents. He's definitely up in the top 10, maybe even top 5, because of what he did in terms of expanding the federal government, in terms of changing its mentality, and also getting America through the Great Depression and World War II. He actually was elected to serve 4 terms. And normally a president serves either 1 or 2 terms, never 4. And actually, we had to pass an amendment after Roosevelt died to say that a president can only serve 2 terms. Roosevelt is the exception because he took over the United States when we were in a depression and then when we entered a war. So we didn't want to have a change of power. And I just have to mention, you all might know about him, but this is our General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. I think he's the highest ranking military leader for Europe in World War II during this time. And this is him when he was a little bit younger, actually. This is in 1948. And later, he actually becomes president of America. But he's a very venerated general. You know, there are like four generals that Americans like know about: Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, George Patton. Let me think of who else. Maybe it's three, but there are a few that every American knows, and he's one of them. He's very well respected. And I just have to mention about D-Day. And I'm trying to keep watching my time, guys, because I'm trying not to go over. But D-Day, so, maybe the Battle of Stalingrad, maybe the Battle of Leningrad is like the major battle that, former Soviet Union citizens, really focus on and memorialize and think about. For us, it's D-Day, which was a major operation in Normandy, France. As big as Pearl Harbor is in American memory, D-Day is the second, or if not equally important in American memory, in American culture. There's even in a movie that focuses on D-Day, and it's Saving Private Ryan. It's one of the most famous movies in America, and it starts with the opening of the D-Day invasion. It's a very important battle, and many people think it's a pivotal moment during the war because this is when the Allies, primarily Britain, Canada, and America, they invade Normandy, France. They take over France, and then they start to move towards Germany. And it's with this win that Germany has to be pushed further and further back to its own nation. And that's when, of course, the Soviet Union takes over and fights in the Battle of Berlin. But D-Day is very important because it's actually the largest seaborne invasion in history. It was actually called Operation Overload, excuse me. Overload meaning it's just so many people. And it was a massive amount of people. It was 73,000 American soldiers that joined an additional 83,000 Allied soldiers, British and Canadian primarily, but there were actually, I believe, 9 nations who contributed forces to D-Day. And it was a major Allied battle and invasion. It took a lot of planning. And just so you know, it's called D-Day. The D doesn't stand for anything special. In military terms, it means it's the day of. You say D+1, D-1 in terms of from that day. Are you one step back? Are you one day before D+1 or D-1? Or are you one day ahead of it, D+1, D-1, D+1? It's a military term, but D-Day just means this is the day that it's going to happen. And it happened on June 4th, 1944. And it was just a large assault, and a lot of people died. But again, it was very important. And it was the American forces took over the beaches on, I don't know how they named them, but America landed on the Omaha and Utah beaches. That's not what they are today, I believe, in France called, but that's what we call them. The British and Canadians landed on the other 3 beaches, Juno, Gold, and Sword. And again, it was a very bloody battle, very deadly. But luckily, the Allies were able to eventually push off the Germans, make them retreat further and further back into France. And so once the shoreline of France is protected, then even more Allied forces jump in, and then they can go push further into Europe. And why you know, one of the reasons why D-Day is important is because historians often think about what would have happened if D-Day didn't succeed. And, some think that, the war would have lasted longer. Maybe Germany would have even won. We're not sure. But it's because of D-Day that we set a path forward into Central Europe, particularly towards Germany. And this is just a very famous image of the invasion. These are actually military barricades put on by the Germans. They did know about the invasion. They didn't know exactly where it was going to happen, but they knew something like it was going to happen. So they put military barricades these metal barricades to try to stop ships from going through onto the shores. So when Americans and other allied soldiers landed, they had to land in the water and then, actually fight from the water. They had to shoot from the water, they had to walk through the water. So it was just a very dramatic battle. I'll just say that. And then here we have the Pacific Front. The Pacific doesn't honestly get a lot of attention, but believe it or not, the majority of Americans fought in the Pacific. They didn't fight in Europe. I think 2 million American troops fought in Europe, but about 14 million fought in the Pacific. But then a few also fought in North Africa. So Pacific is actually a lot more important in terms of in terms of the battles, in terms of the lives lost, but we do have a tendency to focus on Europe again because I think it makes for a nice story. You have evil Nazi Germany fighting the democratic forces of America and Britain and the Soviet Union. But here, the Pacific, you have an empire that's fighting kind of another empire, America. I mean, we're not an empire quite yet, but Japan, they weren't doing this they weren't doing it quite for the same reasons as Germany. They have similar reasons for trying to take over Asia. They believe in a pan Japanese empire. They want to expand the Japanese empire. They do also believe in their racial superiority over other Asian people and other Asian nations. But as far as I'm concerned, they didn't have concentration camps with Jews, and other minorities. That's not to say they didn't treat people well, especially prisoners of war, but it's just not quite the same as Europe. But anyway, the Pacific is still a very important theater. We call it a theater, kind of. It's where the drama happens. And we have some major battles. The Battle of Coral Sea, that was actually the first major battle in which America defeated Japan through mostly our air forces. We have also the Battle of Midway, Battle of Guadalcanal, the Battle of Saipan, and really one of the most famous ones is the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is kind of the final battle. It's kind of like the Battle of Berlin. It's our Battle of Iwo Jima is like the final battle that really pushes Japan back. But of course, as you know, we don't end the war with Japan through battle. We end it through the atomic bombs. And with the Pacific Front, because of the geography of the Pacific, it's not one big continent, it's different islands. The US has to take a different approach. And the way the approach is taken, it's led by a general named General Douglas MacArthur. He's here on the left. He's the supreme commander of the Pacific. He's the equivalent to Eisenhower, but in the Pacific. And he had a very famous pipe that he used to smoke from. But Douglas MacArthur, he leads our troops in the Pacific. And his strategy is to island hop. And it means that we're not going to take over all of Japanese territory. Quite frankly, it's too widespread. The Japanese empire is really widespread. It's all over the place, So we decide to then go strategically to different islands. And what we're trying to do with our strategy is to hop closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. So we're not going to take over all of their territories. We're just going to get closer to their mainland. And again, like I said, the major battles was Midway and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Okinawa was actually near Iwo Jima. We went from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. And even today, actually, we have a major Marine Corps presence in Okinawa, Japan. So this is part of our path towards getting towards Japan closer. But the problem, what was so difficult about Japan is that they would not surrender. Even as we got closer and closer, they would not surrender. And I even learned that Iwo Jima, which is right here, it's one of the most famous battles in America because so many Americans lost their lives, but also so many Japanese. I read somewhere that they had something about 20,000 Japanese troops fought in Iwo Jima, and only 200 of them survived. But again, they wouldn't surrender. They even had kamikaze pilots. For those who may or may not know, kamikaze were the pilots who did basically suicide missions. They would bomb, they would fight, and if they had to die with the plane, they would, and they often did. It was like a suicide mission. And one thing that should be mentioned about the Pacific War and America is that you may know this. The Germans interned and had concentration camps for minorities for different reasons, but America did too. We call them internment camps, but they were basically concentration camps. And we had over 127,000 Japanese Americans in these camps. We also had Italian and Germans Americans, but they were significantly smaller. We had only 1,800. Um, it should be 1,800. I believe it's 1,800 Italian Americans and 11,000 German Americans. Now, most of the people in these camps weren't American citizens, but many of them were. It was a mixture of people in terms of citizenship, no citizenship, green card. But regardless, it's a dark side of American history. And America did later apologize for putting the Japanese into these camps. And we even gave monetary compensation, but it came very late. I believe it came in the 1990s. So, it took a very long time for us to apologize to Japanese Americans for this wrongful decision in our history to do. And the reason why we call them intern. I don't really like that because intern implies like temporary, it's not so bad. These were really concentration camps. We made Japanese Americans follow rules. They had to do labor for us. If they tried to leave the camps, they were shot or they were put in prison. Um, we had these camps because Roosevelt and other American politicians um, believe that they might act against America, that they might act as spies. Some of them were actually Japanese nationals. They were from Japan. So we had this national security order to move all the Japanese Americans, as well as Italian Americans, German Americans, into these camps. But it was really the Japanese who got the brunt end of the stick because Italian Americans are a very large population. Uh, Roosevelt is actually part Italian American. So a lot of them didn't follow the rules. The rules weren't really strictly followed on Italian Americans. German Americans, too, they're the largest immigrant groups. Again, they're not really seen as hostile. The Japanese are seen as more hostile because they're the newer immigrant group. Germans have been in America for hundreds of years. The Italians have been there for 100 years. Japanese were just coming over to America starting the early 1900s. So they're seen as a bigger threat. But again, as I said, America did not end the war through a battle. It ended the war through the atomic bombs. It was Harry Truman, our president, who approved the use of the atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima came on August 6th, 1945. It wiped out 90% of the city and killed 80,000 residents. And of course, many more residents of these cities were affected later by the radiation exposure and had cancer and died. And the bomb that was landed on Hiroshima was called Little Boy because it was a smaller bomb than the one that was on Nagasaki. And Hiroshima was a major manufacturing city, so I think that's why we chose it. And then Nagasaki came 3 days later, and it killed 40,000 residents, um, which is less, but the bomb was even deadlier. The bomb was actually a bigger bomb. It was a more powerful bomb, and it was called Fat Man. And this is even a picture of Nagasaki then and now. So, luckily, Hiroshima, I believe, and Nagasaki have rebuilt themselves. But me personally, I think it was, oh, I don't really like that we dropped these bombs. I think they had negative, far reaching consequences that even Harry Truman didn't realize would happen. This opens uh, the atomic bomb race between the Soviet Union and America. And once you drop a bomb, there's always a threat that someone else will drop a bomb. We open the Pandora's box, as we say. And the reason why we dropped the bombs is Truman really believed, first of all, that the Japanese were not going to surrender, even though America put up a condition of surrender to the Japanese before. They said, we'll give you, we'll give you unconditional surrender. Like, you can surrender to us and we won't give you any conditions for it. But the Japanese Empire refused. And Truman also believed that more and more American lives were going to be lost and killed. Um, the battles were just getting bloodier and bloodier and deadlier on the Pacific front. So that's why he ultimately approved the use of the atomic bombs. He thought that they would, I think, the good would outweigh the bad. Um, I don't think Truman personally could have foreseen the consequences of the use of these bombs, particularly again between America and the Soviet Union, and in general, nuclear power, you know. Um, and the bombs were created under the project we call the Manhattan Project, not because it was in Manhattan, New York. It's because originally the scientists a lot of them came from Manhattan, from the universities in Manhattan, New York. But they were actually, I believe, in out Saint Alamino, New Mexico. It's a small town city in New Mexico, kind of in the middle of nowhere, which was the whole point. They wanted to be secret. And this project to build the atomic bombs, just so you know, it actually began before we even started the war. It started in 1940 when Americans discovered that German scientists were also trying to build atomic bombs. And one of the reasons that helped, and one of the persons that helped us build these atomic bombs and who knew about the German scientists was Albert Einstein. He was the one who kind of warned us about it. But finally, with the use of these atomic bombs, Emperor Hirohito of Japan does surrender through the radio of Japan's surrender. He declares it on the radio on August 15th, 1945. So eventually the war does end, but it doesn't end through battle. It ends through atomic bombs. So I don't know. It's a difficult topic even today for Americans to discuss. And there's always the debate, should we have dropped the bombs? Should we not have dropped the bombs? Many Americans are 50-50, you know? But anyway, moving on to the home front, during the war, many Americans went overseas, primarily men. Some women fought in the war, but it was mostly men because the draft was only for men. And women who fought overseas were often nurses. They weren't in combat, they were on the medical lines, the office lines overseas. So, as many men left for the war, a lot of jobs had to be filled. And so, this is one of the reasons why a lot of women start to join the workforce. Um, in part because we actually have to increase our industrial output. We have to make even more supplies. We have to make more weapons. We have to manufacture more military supplies. So FDR passes the War Powers Act, and he basically gets to have power to direct how American businesses will support the war cause. And there's a big campaign to get more and more women into the workforce to fight and to join these factories. There's also a movement to get more and more African Americans in these factory jobs. And this is useful because, as I said in the past, Black Americans are continuing to migrate to cities and to fill jobs as well. So there's already a huge population of African Americans in cities ready and willing to do the factory jobs. And it was so demanding for work that Congress even they authorized work permits for seasonal workers. And a lot of these seasonal workers, I don't mention it here, they came from Mexico. So we're drawing from women, we're drawing from African Americans, and we're even drawing from Mexican migrants to help us fill the jobs, fill the needs. And to pay for the war effort, the US raises taxes, and it encourages citizens to buy war bonds. It's not what people like. Obviously, no one likes increased taxes, but people understood this is what needed to happen. This was necessary for the US to win the war, to have a total war. And also, the US required citizens to ration their resources to make sure that there are resources left for troops and machines. So, people had to, they were encouraged to grow their own gardens. They would save their scrap metals. They would even drive less and less in their cars. They would carpool so they didn't use as much oil. So it was a huge home front effort. Part of the reason why I think America was successful in the war along with other allies is there was a national cause, there was a national movement to win this, both overseas and at home. So both were synced up. It wasn't like you had a bunch of people who said, I don't want to help America in this war. So again, it's a total war. It takes everyone's efforts. And this is a very famous picture of Rosie the Riveter. This is one of the campaigns to try to join women to join the workforce. It, a rivet is a type of mechanical tool. I can't quite explain it, but it's a tool. But anyway, here she is. She says, "We can do it." She's raising up her arm, showing her biceps. Women can do this. We can join the fight in our own way. This is also a propaganda poster. Give him both barrels, meaning you give the barrel to the machine, the driller who's making the machine, but also the barrel in the gun. So it was a way to, it's a good way to sync how, manufacturing had to go hand in hand with the war cause. And I will just briefly mention about post war America. We'll go more into it next lecture because post war America is not just after the war, it's the culture of America in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even today, I would say. But immediately after America, the America after World War II looked very different from before. First of all, we didn't have a Great Depression. Because we had a lot of jobs, a lot of manufacturing, we had a lot of economic movement growth. So, the New Deal helped America to get out of the Depression, but really it was World War II that set us over it. We kind of never looked back, up until kind of now, actually, with COVID. But during post-war America, especially in the 40s and 50s, we have Presidents Harry Truman and Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower. Remember, Eisenhower was a general and later he becomes president. But during this time period, immediately after the war, there's a great optimism in America. It's kind of a happy go lucky society. Actually, my mother told me that the decade that, so my mom grew up during this time period and she hated the 1950s. And why she hated it is because, you know, everything felt so sterile. Everyone wanted just to be happy. They didn't want to think about the war. They didn't want to think about the horrors of the war. They wanted to move on and they wanted to, live their nice life. The husband, the wife, the two kids, a nuclear family. And it was just it for my mom, she felt like it felt very sterile, wasn't very real. It was, something like out of an advertisement. So that's why she didn't like this decade. But one of the reasons why so many Americans were optimistic is actually because we have this bill, this big law passed. It's called the GI Bill. Uh, I think it stands for General Machines, and it later came on to refer to soldiers from the war, like GI Joe. He's a famous toy in America, and it has a reference to soldiers from the war. So it's a GI Bill. It's passed in 1944. This was also under Roosevelt. I'll mention that it was a major bill for veterans. It's the most influential bill for veterans and soldiers, and it's still present today. The benefits of the GI Bill are still present today. They changed a little bit, but this pass has never gone. This bill has never gone away. And the bill, I should say, grants many benefits to veterans. And there are conditions that they serve 90 days of active duty during the war and that they were honorably discharged. And I think that still applies today to get the GI benefits. And these benefits were influential. They included low cost mortgages. So you could have your slice of the American dream. You could buy a house and you could pay a low cost, interest rate for your mortgage. You had low interest loans, so you could start a business. You also had 1 year unemployment compensation. So if you came home from the war, you weren't stuck trying to find a job immediately. You could get some help. It would help you transition. You would have time. And then it also, I think this is one of the most major ones. It paid for your tuition and living expenses for high school, college, and vocational school. And why this is so important is it really it first of all, it grows the second higher education in America just grows incredibly and astronomically after the war, because more and more students can join the universities, and a lot of soldiers who were young at the time, they go to school, they go to college, they go to high school, and they're encouraged to because the government will pay for it. And even today, if you join the military and you serve a certain time period, I think now it's 4 years actually, you receive tuition benefits. And you can even join the officer reserve training program in colleges. So you can train to be in the military during college, and then your college is paid for, but you still have to serve 4 years active duty. Um, but again, this is very influential bill, because now more and more Americans are able to have their own house. They're able to start their own businesses. They're able to get educated, get the education they need to increase. And more Americans, they start to move into these suburbs, which we call, like a famous one, which we call Levittown. Levittown is one of the first housing, not a project, housing project. It's similar. It's a row of houses that were all created. They were kind of created alike, but they were built at a low cost, and they were built so that people who had low cost mortgages, who didn't have a lot of money, but they weren't really poor, could afford to have a house. So a lot of soldiers were able to go to these houses and buy them at a very low cost. And again, they're very inexpensive because they're not very expensive materials to be created. They're not built out of marble, but they're still a sturdy house. They're not very big, but they're still a house. You don't have to live in an apartment anymore. So again, this also is a big transition, because now you have more and more people moving from cities, actually outside of cities. They're moving to the suburbs, the area outside of cities. So this is where we have the growth of the suburbs in America. And I have to say, I'm one of those people. I live in a suburb. Um, I don't know how I feel about that, but it's just very common for Americans, particularly middle class, upper class Americans, to live in suburbs. And it's more and more common with, honestly, white Americans. Not all. There are definitely Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans who live in suburbs, but it's predominantly white Americans. And one thing I should mention about post war America, this is now where we start to transition from producing goods to offering services. And I'll get more into that next lecture, but this is where because we have so much. Uh, um, because we have so many soldiers and men and women even who have now acquired experience and education to where they can have managerial or manager positions, we have less and less need for people to produce goods, and now we're offering services. We're producing so many goods that now we have our corporate headquarters here, and we need people to manage our corporations. We need people to to manage our big automobile factories. We also have the birth of other big technologies like computers. So again, we're going less from a goods economy to a service economy. And I should mention, as part of our post-war America, we have what we have. We have the start of the Cold War. But before I get into the Cold War here, I just want to mention that the Cold War, people say it starts after the Second World War, but it really began in the early 1920s. I didn't mention this last lecture because I thought it'd be better just to mention it here when I start to talk about the Cold War. But America, ever since the Soviet Union began, honestly, from the very beginning, we didn't have a very good relationship. Um, Part of the reason why is because Americans, we always favor democracy, we always favor capitalism, even if the two don't always go hand in hand. And we look at other government regimes that might be different, like communism, like fascism, anything different, with suspicion. That's not to say communism is necessarily fascism, but we look at any type of government regime that's not democratic, that's not pro capitalist, as suspicious and anti American. And after the Bolsheviks seized power and formed the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the US still wouldn't recognize it. We would not internationally recognize the USSR for 16 years because we to acknowledge it means we agree with it or approve of it, even if it's minimal approval. So we didn't want to do that. We really believed that a Red Scare would overtake the US, that something like a Red Menace would overtake the US. We were scared that the communism that was spreading in the Soviet Union and other countries in Eastern Europe and Asia, it was going to spread and take all over the world. And it was going to come to America and destroy what we knew of about America. Um, as we were noticed in the early 1920s in America, as we were noticing communism growing, as we noticed it overtaking the Soviet Union, we start to have more and more suspicion. And the Attorney General under President Wilson, his name was A. Mitchell Palmer, he starts to do raids on people's homes. And he started to arrest individuals who had socialist tendencies. What does that mean? I don't really know. It's anyone whom they were suspicious were pro-communist, or might be pro-Soviet Union, or might even just be pro-labor unions or pro-socialism, not even full communism. There was just this great threat that if you had any little bit of communist sentiment in America, then it was going to overtake the entire country. And this is the start of our Cold War, really, here. And this is actually when we have the beginnings of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. It's actually the FBI who start to do these raids along with Palmer, and they get help from a very famous man, J. Edgar Hoover, who later becomes the head of the FBI for 40 years, I think. But J. Edgar Hoover, he helped Palmer to lead these raids, and he would unlawfully spy on people, listen onto their telephone conversations, put bugs, microphones in their homes of anybody whom he suspected were pro communist or pro socialist or had any sort of sentiments towards the Soviet Union. Again, this was a very paranoid moment in American history. Um, and one of the reasons why it grew, I would say, why we had the Red Scare is because it came at the culmination, the apex of our immigration in America. We had a lot of immigrants, especially from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe, coming to America, millions of them. And this scared actually a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans were afraid that these foreigners were bringing in ideas, diseases, religions that were different from America, from the America that they had known in their lifetime. And they thought that America was going to permanently change for the worse because of these immigrants. So you have a lot of xenophobia, fear of the outsider during this time period because of immigration. And so that xenophobia really was helpful for creating the Red Scare that overtook America. The Red Scare, it was not just a scare of communism, it was a scare of foreigners, of Eastern Europeans, of Russian immigrants. Um, and it's the first wave of, um, it's the very beginning, I would say, of the Cold War. We have the Cold War again really starting up after the World War II. But I would say this is the beginnings of the Cold War. that we know it today. And this is just a poster. I didn't caption this. I'm sorry, guys. This is a poster of a movie that came out. It was called The Red Menace. It was a very successful movie that came out. Oh, I should have put the year. I'm very sorry. It's sometime in the 1920s, I believe. But it was, it's a great caption. It's a great image of just how people were afraid. The most serious threat to our nation today, communism. Using the guise of moral values, the red menace creeps like a cancer across the land, poisoning minds, corrupting our youth, threatening world peace, sowing hatred, intolerance, cultural division, greed, injustice, arrogance, and delusions of superiority, and cutting a wide swath of war, death, devastation, disease, and human misery abroad. God, that's a lot for one caption. But I like this image because it encapsulates the paranoia, the fears that a lot of Americans were starting to have with the growth of communism and with the birth of the Soviet Union. Um, and I think it's a little silly, but at the same time, I didn't live in America in 1920s. So I don't think it's really fair for me to say how people should have thought during the 1920s. Me personally, I hope I wouldn't be as paranoid as they are, but people were. It's how they felt. And then, so with the Red Scare, we have it in the 1920s, but then we start to have it again after World War II. We start to have it in the 1950s, actually. But the Cold War, as we know it, many historians say that it actually starts during World War II. It doesn't happen after World War II. It really starts to begin during World War II. Because even though the US and the USSR were allies in the war, that doesn't mean they were buddy buddies. Stalin did not like the Allies, in part because he really felt like the Allies should have invaded France earlier. D-Day came in 1944. Stalin thought that was way too late. And as you know, the Soviet Union had to defend the East. And it cost a lot of lives. It cost a lot of resources. It cost it was World War II is the costliest war for the Soviet Union and for a majority of Russia and Eastern Europe today. It was a major war. So Stalin did not like that the Allies waited. Why did we wait? I'm not really sure. Maybe because D-Day and the invasion of France, it did take some planning. It was not a simple plan. It wasn't a simple invasion. Oh, let's just land here and fight. It took, I think, took about a year and a half to plan, actually. So it took a long time. But Stalin believed that Eastern Europe was his sphere of influence. Okay, America and Britain, you can have Western Europe, you can have Asia and all these other areas that you claim to have influence over, but Eastern Europe is mine. And we get to say what happens there. And the Allies, especially America and Britain, did not share that feeling. The Allies did not like the fact that Stalin was claiming Eastern Europe because then they really feared that it was going to become communist and that communism would just grow. So there was animosity to begin with. It wasn't a good relationship. It worked out because we had to win the war, but it's because we had a common enemy. We had a common enemy with Italy and Germany, but that doesn't mean we were the best of friends, unfortunately. And it's one of the reasons why the Cold War starts because it's really an era of suspicion. And it's a Cold War because there was actually never really a war. It was just, close hits. It was suspicious activity. It was, cold relations. And some of the famous terms and policies during the Cold War, starting in the 1950s, I'm just going to go over a little bit. I'm going to go also over the Cold War. I can't do all of it in this lecture because the Cold War spans up until 1990s. So next lecture, I'll do the lecture by decades, and we'll study American culture and history, but we'll also study the Cold War through each decade with the Korean War, with the Vietnam War, up to Star Wars and Chernobyl even, and the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. But here is the early policies of the Cold War in America. And some of the famous terms that you may or may not heard of. First of all, we have the term Iron Curtain. This was not originally from Churchill, but he quoted it, and it's become associated with him. And the Iron Curtain was just a term to mean the border that separates Eastern and Western Europe between Soviet backed territory and Allied backed territory. And it was like an iron curtain. It was a curtain, like you couldn't see past one another's borders. And it was iron because it kind of in reference to the Soviet Union and Stalin. He was supposedly called himself a man of steel. So that's kind of a nice term to express the border here of the Iron Curtain between East and Western Europe, basically. We also have the term the Cold War, which actually came from George Orwell, who wrote his famous book 1984. But again, it doesn't refer to an actual war. It refers more to the cold relations between the US and NATO countries and the Soviet Union. Um, and it was cold in the sense that nothing ever really blew up. Nothing, no weapons were actually, you know a war never broke out. Bullets weren't really fired, nothing hot came out. It was just always cold. People were always ready for war, but it never blew up into a war. We also have the domino theory. This was a theory and a fear that gained traction starting in the 1950s, really. And it was the belief that if one nation fell to communism, then its neighbors would also fall to communism, like dominoes in a row. Um, and again, this was I have a hard time understanding the Cold War because I think it's incredible that people would think this, that they would be this paranoid, that they would be this suspicious, but they were, they were. So people really believe that, oh my God, communism could spread. And they believed this in the 1920s and they believed this in the 1950s. And more so in the 1950s because it is actually happening. Russia and the Soviet Union is taking other parts of countries with it. It takes Ukraine, it takes Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. It starts to influence itself in Hungary and Poland. So this fear is real in some ways. It is, it is happening. The Soviet Union is expanding and its influence is expanding. And there's a very famous man named George F. Kennan who in 1946 basically believes that, okay, the US can't stop the Soviet Union from existing. It can't really even stop it from spreading. It can try, but it can't stop it from existing. What's been done has been done. You can't We're not going to invade the Soviet Union and take it over and make it democratic. That's just not feasible. It's not what we want. We don't want a war really with the Soviet Union. So instead of trying to reverse countries that become communists, instead the US is going to try to stop communism spread. Try to stop the domino from falling. We're going to contain it, to this area. And, this policy becomes doctrine. We have the Truman Doctrine. And Truman actually gives money to Greece and Turkey so to help fight, Soviet, I think it was communist forces. I'm not sure if they were directly from the Soviet Union, but there were forces trying to take over Greece and Turkey and turn it into a sphere of influence for the Soviet Union, try to turn it communist. And Truman actually gives $400 million to Greece and Turkey to fight these forces. So it's the very beginning of our, containment policy, giving money to other countries to fight communism. And during this time period, too, we have a very famous period we call McCarthyism. It is our second Red Scare. We have Red Scare in the 1920s and in the 1950s, and we call the second Red Scare McCarthyism. It's actually named after a famous senator named Joseph McCarthy. He was hell-bent on finding any communists and communist activities. He was going to find it, he was going to arrest it, and he was going to put it in jail. And he was hell-bent on it. He would not stop. Um, and he really epitomizes the period when many Americans are paranoid about communism and when they start to suspect each other of being communist sympathizers. It's no longer the government watching people, it's people watching people. And he encourages it and he fuels the fire for it. I personally don't like this man. I think he was a terrible influence in our country, but he was a very influential senator. He was. He later died, actually, I think in 1957, 58. But regardless, he was very influential. He got a lot of supporters for his cause, for his Red Scare cause, basically. And then the last thing I want to mention about the Cold War is we start to have this, along with helping countries to fight communist forces, we also start to give money to countries to prop up democracies, not even necessarily to fight communism, but to make sure that they are economically viable to become democracies. So, Secretary of State George Marshall, and I believe this is under Eisenhower in the 1950s, he decides we're going to give $17 billion over 4 years to Great Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium. These are all nations that really struggled after World War II to recover. And one of the reasons why we want to give money to Europe is because Americans really believe that one of the reasons why fascism rose to power in the 1930s is because Europe was so devastated, it had no help from America. It had no economic support. It couldn't get out of its depression. So the United States made a commitment after World War II that this is not going to happen again. We're not going to have fascism again in Western Europe. We saw what happened, and we saw that we're going to help Europe to try to rebuild itself. And to be honest, it works. Europe is, especially Western Europe, is significantly better. I think in part because we gave so much support. We're not the only reason why Europe did well after World War II, but I think our money and our government support helped. It helps. It gives a boost. And notice it's Western is a World War II and the Cold War. And I will say, I think George Marshall, we don't give enough importance to this plan of his because it's where our current mentality of giving aid to other countries comes from. Ukraine is actually one of the biggest recipients today of Ukrainian aid. And, part of it is to help fight Russian influence. But it's also to try to make sure that countries that want democracy, that want economic prosperity, that they have some help, that they get some help to boost this. And it all really stems from, I think, the Marshall Plan. He's the very beginnings of US aid to other countries. And the aid doesn't just go to Europe. We also give a lot of aid to Japan too. And we give a lot of aid later to South Korea. And it's another reason why I think, South Korea and Japan are successful after World War II, even though they've just been devastated, especially Japan. We give a lot of money, we give a lot of support, we try to rebuild economies. And sometimes this works out and sometimes this doesn't, as we'll see in our next lecture. And these are just some images I wanted to show you all of the Cold War. We have the Iron Current map here, kind of the boundary between East and West influence. We have here the domino theory, the fear that Asia especially will fall and that somehow it will come to the United States. I have here the spheres of influence, the Soviet Union. I have no idea why it says it includes Russia. I think everybody knows that. But this is kind of like the division. And then this is Senator Joseph McCarthy showing Communist Party activity in the US in the 1950s. Where he gets this evidence, I have no idea. But a lot of people loved it, or not loved it, but they believed in him. They were like, oh my God, we have so much communism in our country. We need to fight it. We need to go after it. And then this here is just the Marshall Plan's logo. For European recovery, supplied by the United States of America. This is, again, kind of the beginnings of USAID, where we give a lot of support to other countries to help their infrastructure, to help their economies so that they don't fall into economic despair. And so hopefully they don't fall into, fascism or dictatorships. It's kind of the purpose of USAID. I think also, though, people support USAID. I just want to mention because they also believe that America, we have the possibility to help people, we should, you know. Um, and I'm very sorry, guys, I'm going over time, but I do need to mention this next part. Um, I'll try to go quickly through it. It's just a couple more slides. Um, we have the separate but unequal continuation in the separate but unequal that we saw during Jim Crow, where you have equal or you have separate facilities, separate, policies for Black and white Americans, but they were supposed to be equal, but they weren't. We have this continuing from the late 1800s to the 1960s. And I just want to mention, it's not just in schools, it's not just in workplaces or shops, it's even in the military. We have this problem. Um, and it's weird because, ever since the American Revolution, Black Americans have served in the military, approximately 4,000 prior to World War II. Served in the military. So it's not like Black Americans have never served in the military, they have, but they are often relegated or put onto low positions. They were treated very much like second class citizens. And they rarely, if ever, received compensation and recognition for their service. It's again a dark side of our history, an ugly side of our history, but it's there. It's true. Um, and during the Revolutionary War, a lot of Black Americans left their plantations. They tried to fight for America's freedom, but only 20% were freed. The rest had to go back to plantations. Um, they fought during the Civil War. We had the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which is all Black soldiers. They fought for American causes. They fought to continue to make America free. But again, they were second class citizens, both at war and at home. World War II changes that, though. It really does. And this is why I say World War II is probably the most influential war in America besides the Civil War. World War II for Black Americans was major. Over 1 million Black Americans served in World War II. That's exceedingly more than who have served in the past wars. But the problem is, after the war, they're still treated as second class citizens. The GI Bill and the benefits that a lot of Americans, white Americans, received, they were denied to Black Americans. It wasn't legal. They weren't legally allowed to be denied, but they were. People looked the other way. They made excuses to not help Black Americans. So they did not receive the benefits and the help that so many white Americans got after the war. And it's one of the reasons why we have, even today, racial disparities between white and Black Americans, especially in terms of education. A lot of white Americans were able to receive education due to the GI Bill, and then their children were able to receive it because then they received good jobs, good businesses. So for Black Americans, this was just another slap in the face. And even with President Truman, he actually orders the desegregation of all military units. So, but even with this order, Black Americans realize they need to do more to change America, to finally experience the justice and equality that they deserve. And just because Truman orders the desegregation of forces in the military, there's still racism in the military, even today. It's better than it was before, but we still have it, you know. And I just want to show you this picture. This is a Tuskegee Airman. His name is Clarence E. Buddy Huntley. He is an airman. He fought in World War II. This is a picture of him in 2011. He actually died, I think, last year. But there was actually a group of African American pilots. There was about 950 of them. They were called the Tuskegee Airmen because they were trained in the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, but they were incredible pilots. They're some of the famed pilots of World War II. They had no fear. And so I just wanted to show you a picture, of one of the African American veterans, they're very regarded and very revered now in America for their bravery. So, as I said, Black Americans are realizing something after World War II. They're realizing that they fought for freedom. They deserve freedom, but also they fought racism. So why on earth should they have to fight racism again? And why do they even have to have and face racism in America again when they come home? Um, there is a lot of hypocrisy that Black Americans recognized in fighting racist enemies abroad, but then having to fight racist enemies at home, basically, even to those Americans who didn't want to admit it. A lot of Americans wanted to look the other way, but Black Americans were like, no, we've had enough of this. So they're starting to have this movement. They call it the double V campaign, where they need, it's the idea that they have victory abroad, but they're going to have victory at home too. You know, the sacrifices that their brothers, their mothers, their fathers made abroad, they're going to have to continue this fight at home. So there is this feeling, this growing movement to speak out louder against the injustices that they face. And World War II is important because, you know, it gives them a lot of confidence. A lot of Black soldiers who come home are now confident that they can speak out, that they have a right to speak out against the injustices that they feel. And it takes a while, but we're having slowly and slowly, America is starting its civil rights movement. And it really begins with Rosa Parks. She's kind of the spark for the civil rights movement. In December of 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, she refuses to give up her seat to a white passenger. And this is actually a photograph of her. She's the woman here, and this is the white passenger who's not happy. But she's like, nope, you know what? I'm not going to follow the rules. I'm not going to give you my seat. I'm going to sit here because I've had a long day. I deserve to sit here. I'm a passenger. And she actually is arrested, but a lot of people find out about her action. It's well known among African Americans at home. You know, they learn about her and her protests. And it's a very simple action, but it turns into a much bigger campaign. Reverend Martin Luther King, he decides, you know what? In response to Rosa Parks and to support her, we're going to have a big bus boycott. Uh, we African Americans are not going to use the bus. We're going to walk, we're going to carpool, we're not going to use the buses. And this is actually very costly because a lot of riders, a lot of people who use the bus, even today, are Black Americans, Latino Americans too. So this really hurts the bus company. And actually, it gains a lot of traction to the point where it goes up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules in Park's favor, actually. They say that she has the right to sit in front of the bus before she had to go in the back of the bus. And she has the right to sit there. So the Supreme Court also starts to change during this time period. And this is pivotal because she wins her case. And it shows to many people out there, especially Black Americans, hey, this whole protest, this whole nonviolence, it works. It changes things. So she is really, many say she's the catalyst for the civil rights movement. She's the one who really starts to move it forward. People were fighting before the civil rights movement for Black equality, but this is where it really starts to go up. And the civil rights movement, it refers to a general period beginning in the 1940s through the 1960s, actually, where you have Black Americans trying to end racial discrimination, and they're trying to really gain equal rights under the law. No more separate but equal, no more second class citizens. And it's a movement, you know, and it actually affects other minority groups to where they also start to fight. And it's a very important movement because it not only protects Black Americans' rights, it actually protects other Americans' rights, particularly women and Latinos and immigrants. So it has an effect on a lot of other minorities in America. So we have a lot to thank for Martin Luther King and other civil rights leader today. And this is actually a statue of him, just so you know, a memorial to Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C. It was actually very controversial because it's white. It's a little bit awkward because he was a famous Black American, but they kept it white because they wanted it to be white like the other monuments in Washington, D.C. But anyway, just to go over some of the major acts and years of the civil rights movement, there's four. First of all, we had the Brown versus Board of Education, which is a famous court case by the Supreme Court. They basically say that you can't be separate but equal. When you separate something, it's not equal. That's racial segregation in public schools. They're not equal and they need to end. And you need to start to integrate these schools. However, just so you know, just because something is changed on paper doesn't mean people themselves change. So a lot of people have difficulty with segregation ending it, and they don't like integration of schools. I just want to mention that. Then 10 years later, takes 10 years, but it happens. Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the president after John F. Kennedy, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And basically, it says you can't discriminate against people due to their race, their color, their sex, religion, or even national origin. You can't. You can't restrict them from having their rights in work and from getting equal pay because of these reasons. They need to be treated equally. He also signs the Voting Rights Act, Johnson, to prevent the use of literary tests for voting. And this was a big way to prevent Black Americans, many who didn't know how to read at the time, especially after the Civil War. A lot of them didn't know how to read, and so they couldn't vote. So Johnson says, you can't put this test into place. Um, and it also allowed federal examiners, people from the federal government, to review voter qualifications and to monitor polling places to make sure that Southern states, particularly, were allowing people to vote, that they weren't barring them or stopping them. And then finally, Johnson has to sign another Civil Rights Act in 1968 because there's just a lot of injustices he has to correct. It's called the Fair Housing Act, and it makes sure that people get equal access to houses and apartments and rent, regardless, again, of their race, religion, or national origin. Because, you know, one of the ways you can prevent people from climbing up the social ladder is you can make it hard for them to own a house. You know, a lot of Black Americans had to live in very poor conditions, poor houses, poor apartments. Even if they could afford something better, they were discriminated against from living in nice neighborhoods, nice apartments, because white people didn't want Black Americans next to them. So these are some of the major acts that happened from the civil rights. And I just have two more slides for you guys. Thank you for being patient. I'm sorry. It's just a lot to cover, I realize. But I just wanted to point out the the most famous figures in the civil rights movement. You've definitely heard of Martin Luther King Jr. Some of you may or may not heard of Malcolm X. I would say they are two very famous men during this time period, in part because they represent two opposing sides to how to battle racial discrimination. You know, you have nonviolence versus by any means necessary. And I'll explain that to you. So Martin Luther King, he was born to a pastor, um, like a religious leader, a Baptist priest. So he grew up in a different environment than Malcolm X, who was born as Malcolm Little. Actually, that's Malcolm X. The X is not his original last name. But when Malcolm X was born, when he was 6, he watched his father be killed by a mob of white men. So that has a very influential image and experience on his life. And whereas Martin Luther King, he's born to a pastor, so he gets to hear sermons and he gets to hear a lot about Jesus and nonviolence. So they have a different influence, different upbringing. And Martin Luther King, he is able to attend college. He majors in law and medicine. I don't know how you do both, but he did. Uh, he meets his wife. He moves to Montgomery, Alabama, and he becomes a pastor. So he's following in his father's footsteps. And Malcolm X, he gets into trouble, to be honest. He wrongfully so, you know, he gets like a lot of Black men today in America, you know, he's wrongfully in prison, but nevertheless, he's arrested and he goes to jail. And while in jail, he learns about Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And it's a religious organization based on Islam, but it's really more or less a Black nationalist group. They use Islam as a tool to advocate for Black nationalism and Black justice. And Martin Luther King, he's different. He starts the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's a conference of civil rights activists, and he is a big advocate for nonviolent protests. He's influenced by Jesus, he's influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. He really believes in nonviolence as a means to racial justice. And Malcolm X, he's a little bit different. He's like, you know what? The enemy is the white people. We can't be nice to them. We can't, shake hands with them and do nonviolence. If we have to be violent by any means necessary, then that's what we need to do. We need to get justice however we can, even if it's violent or maybe it's not. So these are two men who have two different approaches to racial justice. Um, and I'll just mention Malcolm X, he does later actually go on a pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, and his views soften, but he still condemns racism. And he's still a proponent for, Black Americans need to do what's best for them. Um, and unfortunately, both men are assassinated for their views. No one's really sure who assassinated Malcolm X, but we know who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. I think it was Lee Harvey Oswald. No, that's who assassinated JFK. I'll look this up. But regardless, both men are assassinated. So they're big martyrs for the civil rights movement. And they just represent two different perspectives on how to get justice. Do you do it by any means necessary, or do you do nonviolence? And here's a picture, just so you know, of Malcolm X to the left here. This is what he looked like. And this is actually Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay, as he was known before he converted to Islam. And this is Martin Luther King here on the left, a photograph of him. So finally, I will just end the lecture with this last slide. And this is a good way to end the presentation, because the civil rights movement, it really is a movement not only against racial injustice, but it's a movement that questions the post-war optimistic America. And it also questions even the Cold War. There are a lot of civil rights leaders who question the Cold War and why we're so paranoid about communism. And, rather than focusing on communism, maybe we should focus on ourselves and how we're not a fully democratic nation. But the turning point, where America starts to really change is through integration. A lot of Americans didn't like that they had to integrate their schools with Black Americans. There is another period of a backlash. As I said, after the Civil War, we have a backlash against Black Americans. We have another one after World War II and during the Civil Rights Movement, where Americans, especially white Americans in the South, they start to get very angry and violent against Black Americans. It's not to say they weren't violent before, but they really go after Black students who are trying to attend school. They intimidate, they harass, and they sometimes physically hurt Black Americans who try to exercise their rights. And there's two very famous cases of this. There were 9 Black students who tried to attend school, an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the president during integration, he has to actually send in the military, the National Guard, to protect these students from their from their white students, from their white school classmates, and other white parents who are angry that they're attending school. And it really, I say it's the world turned upside down, because it's just like, what is going on? You have students who are trying to attend school, but they're getting harassed and hurt by white Americans, some of them who are their classmates. It's ridiculous. And it goes so far that Eisenhower has to send troops, military troops. And it's not to defend, against fascism, it's to defend against white Americans who are trying to hurt other Americans. It really epitomizes honestly, what a hard thing this was for Black Americans to do, to attend school. And this happened in 1957. It's called the Little Rock Nine incident. And another very famous case was, and I have to mention her because she came from my city, New Orleans. There was a 6-year-old girl named Ruby Bridges who wanted to attend school, and it was an all-white elementary school. Her mother wanted her to attend the school, and she becomes the first student to attend an elementary school in actually United States, but it's in New Orleans. And she's trying to attend school, but because of the harassment and the violence she experiences and her family, she has to be escorted by U.S. Marshals. U.S. Marshals are like the police force for the national government. They're a little bit different from the FBI, but they have to escort her, like how the military has to help and protect the Black students to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this was actually a very famous picture. It's actually a painting. It's based on a photograph of Ruby having to be escorted by the US Marshals. So that's where they are here. These are the US Marshals. This is her. She's walking. She's innocent. She's just a 6-year-old little girl. And, there's a tomato trying to be thrown at her, and someone wrote a very horrible word. And you even see here the KKK, so it's a good place to end the lecture, because this is the start of America and its crazy years happening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's the start of it. The civil rights movement, it doesn't just change Black Americans, it changes America overall. And that also comes with, the Cold War. The Cold War also changes America. And we'll talk some more about that in the next lecture. But this is just kind of the start of how America as we know it today versus America before World War II. So I want to thank you all for your patience. I'm sorry that was longer than I intended. As you know, I have a tendency to talk a lot, but let me just try to answer your questions quickly. Our next lecture, which will be the second half of the 20th century, after World War II and up until really the September 11th attacks, we'll cover. We'll cover all of America in the second 20th century, the late 20th century. And that will be June 2nd. So, and also I'll just leave you this with some movies that you can, let me get the chat. Here we go. All right. These are some movies, guys, that if you want to watch more about, World War II, the Cold War, even the Holocaust too, which I know I didn't go over, but obviously I had a lot to cover. There's some really good movies here, and you've probably seen some of them, but these are just some of my recommendations. So let me just answer your questions. So the first one is, do you know any better healthcare system in other countries? Oh, Lordy, I don't know. I know like England and Great Britain has a national healthcare system. I don't really know what it's like, to be honest. Our neighbors up north, Canada, have a healthcare system, a national healthcare system, and that seems to work pretty well for them. I know, obviously, a lot of northern Scandinavian countries and even Western European countries have national healthcare systems, but I don't know how good they are. I have heard that you don't always get the best care. You might have to wait in long lines, but I don't know if these are really true. I would have to really hear from other people in Europe and Canada to see how they like or do not like their national healthcare system. I will say one thing. What some people fail to recognize about America is that we are a very large country, and to have a national healthcare system is going to cost a lot of money. And as you know, we already spend a lot of money on everything, especially our military. So I don't know if we could afford a national healthcare system. I personally am in favor of it. I'm willing to try it because our healthcare system today is private. And what that means, unfortunately, is that if you can afford good healthcare, great, you're going to do well in America. But if you can't afford our healthcare, which is expensive, then you're kind of out of luck. You're gonna have you're gonna have a hard time getting good medical care, preventative care. I've always said this, but America has the best education and medical care, I believe, if you can afford it, though. That's the problem with our healthcare and our education. It's only to those who can afford it, who can pay for the cost. And that's why we have, I think, our income inequality. It's because to the victor goes the spoils, or rather, to the rich go the lucky and the fortunate. And that's not fair, in my opinion. Uh, and so we have 330 million people in our country we would have to provide healthcare for. And we have very different ideas and different needs for healthcare. So, in a place like Finland, in a place like Norway, they generally have a homogenous population, meaning most people, are a certain race, they're a certain religion, they're a certain economic background, educational background. We have a lot of diversity in America, and I don't think we can have one healthcare system that works for everyone. We have to somehow make it flexible for different groups of people. So I hope to have it. I am in favor of a national healthcare system, but I don't know how it would work. So, all right, question number 2. I know about the so-called lost generation in literature and art. Could you recommend to read or watch something? How did they affect the post-war period, the depression? Oh, good question. So the post-war um oh, sorry guys. The post-war the lost generation that this question is referring to is the period in the 1920s when a lot of Americans, writers and artists, felt lost. Like, where was America going? We're in this Great Depression, or we're starting to enter this depression. We have the Roaring Twenties, but it's all full of materialism. It's all full of capitalism. What are we really doing as a nation? Like, are we more than just money? Are we more than just buying goods? So the lost generation is really questioning, America's wealth and its prosperity, especially during the 1920s and even the 1930s. You have writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. That's probably the most famous novel during this time period, the 1920s. And it's all about a great writer to read during this time period. And I also recommend William Faulkner. William Faulkner wrote during this time period, and even though he doesn't really talk about the lost generation like F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway, he's still writing about America during the 19 teens and 20s in the South. Because the South, as I said in the last lecture, it's doing different, it's doing worse than the North. And even during the Roaring Twenties, it's doing really poor compared to the North. The South never quite has the wealth and the riches that the North has, especially after the Civil War. And even still today, there's a disparity and an economic difference between the North and the South in America. So I recommend those three: F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and William Faulkner. You can also read Eugene O'Neill's play and T.S. Eliot's poems. I think T.S. Eliot, though, was British. Forgive me if I'm wrong, guys. I don't read a lot of this time period. I like um, more of after World War II literature. But all right, third question: the little boy and the fat man stopped the Japan-U.S. war, but became a beginning for the Cold War between USSR and U.S. It became the beginning in terms of the whole world saw what America could do. And what America could do was build an atomic bomb and drop it on a nation. And that was really the ultimate power at that moment. And still today, we always think of the highest form of power that you can exercise as a nation is an atomic bomb. And why this really sparks the Cold War is because the Soviet Union sees that America has an atomic bomb and they're suspicious of America. And so the Soviet Union starts to build up its own nuclear weapons and its own atomic bombs. And so you have actually the start of an arms race where the USSR and the US is racing to build the best technologies, the best military, the best spaceships, the best weapons. It's a race. Who can outdo one another? And the fat man and the little boy just showed what the US was capable, and it scared a lot of people, including the USSR and including Americans. A lot of people didn't even know we had atomic weapons. This was a secret. Even Truman didn't know about the atomic weapons until someone told him about it. So it didn't spark the Cold War, but it helped to bring momentum to it, especially in terms of the arms race, because now, the USSR could see what it could do, what the US could do. A comment is, I hope we will not have empires in the 21st century. I don't know. I don't, there is a theory. I'll just say this. There is a man named, oh my gosh, what is his name? There is a international relations scholar, Ian Bremmer. Ooh, lordy. Ian Bremmer. He is a pretty influential guy. He's young, actually. I think he's in his 40s. And he has this theory. We have a G8 or a G7 summit where the 7 or 8 great nations, depending if Russia is in or not, where the nations meet together and they go over big topics. They decide on world affairs. And there's this international relations scholar named Ian Bremmer who believes that we're now starting to enter a world where we don't have really 7 or 8 great nations. We have what we call a G0 world, where no nation is really taking over the world. You have some powerful nations, nations that can, do some damage or have economic influence. But generally speaking, you don't have one nation that is taking over the world or 1 or 2 nations. You have a G0 world where, it's not, we're not really sure who is leading the world right now. Is it America? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it Japan? Is it England? No one really knows for sure. Is it the EU, Germany? Could it be, somewhere in Africa, like South Africa? Like, are there nations that are emerging? So I'm not sure if we're going to have empires, or maybe we'll have a different kind of empire. Uh, so another comment, isn't it Manchuria defeat was the break point of Japan? So that's a good point. The Soviet Union did enter a war with Japan, and they did fight over Manchuria, the area in eastern China near Vladivostok. So I don't know if that's the breaking point of Japan. I actually don't know this side of the Soviet Japanese war. I have been told, and from what I understand from historians, the breaking point was the atomic bombs. Because how is Japan, first of all, supposed to fight against an atomic weapon? It doesn't have any on its own. And we dropped 2 bombs. We didn't drop 1 bomb, we dropped 2. So that shows to the Japanese empire that, hey, they don't just have one, they have possibly many, and they're willing to use it. So might they destroy our entire empire? But that is a very good point. Certainly Manchuria could have influenced, the Japanese surrender. I don't know though. I'll look more into that. I do know about it though, that the Soviet Union also fought the Japanese. Um, uh, Oksana, oh, D-Day is the 6th of June. Oh my gosh. Okay, guys. So I might have gotten the date wrong. That's terrible of me. I'll fix that. Thank you for letting me know. Sometimes I get my facts wrong. And thank you for correcting me. It could be June 6th. I believe you. I think I put June 4th. So I'm very sorry about that. So June 6th. Thank you for correcting me. Another question. There was no point in nuclear bombing except testing. Japan was already defeated in Manchuria, their main point. Okay, so again, I don't know this side of history. And this is where, again, America has its version of World War II. And sometimes unfairly, we don't study the other sides of World War II. So this is something I'll look into. But what I've been told by my professors, my teachers, that it was the atomic bomb that eventually ended the war for the US, at least with Japan. Unfortunately, I mean, certainly Manchuria could have had a part, and it might have been a reason why they surrendered. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. Another comment is so much dollars was spent for researches. So if you not use it, you will be jailed after those losses. Mm, well, certainly we had a lot of research. The Manhattan Project was a big project for the US. We spent millions, billions of dollars for those atomic weapons. So, yeah, in some ways, it would be a lost cause if you didn't use what you researched. However, I don't know, I don't even think Albert Einstein and Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, the leaders of the Manhattan Project, I don't know if they actually really intended to use the atomic weapons. they wanted it because if you have a weapon, you can still threaten people with it. But I don't think they imagined the US using it, at least using it so soon. I think even Albert Einstein has regrets about the use of the atomic bombs afterwards. And personally, I wish we never used it, me personally. I know it would have cost maybe more US lives, it would have cost more Soviet lives, but what it unleashed, I think, was awful. And I think it unleashed nuclear power. And yes, we probably would have had nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, even if we didn't use the bombs, but we saw how it could be used. And so it was a big deterrence and fear, especially between the US and USSR. And it drove a Cold War that I don't think needed to happen, that did happen. I don't think the Cold War would have been as influential or would have been as large as it was, so to speak, if we hadn't used the nuclear bombs. But that's just my opinion. Again, I'm not a historian. I teach history, but I don't research it really a whole lot. I would love to do more research, but I have to get a PhD for that. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Again, sorry I went over time, but thank you for joining me. Next week will be the post-war America up into September 11th. The America that my parents know and that I really know well. We'll discuss that, and we'll continue with the Cold War. Obviously, the Cold War continues through the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until the 90s. And I will also mention that's lecture 6. But lecture 7, our final lecture, I will talk about US Russian relations and US Ukrainian relations, and really America after 9/11. So those are our last 2 lectures. I just want to give you a heads up as to what we'll be talking about. So thank you, everyone, for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you June 2nd.